They climbed to the summit, dreaming of glory, but instead they found a destroyed tent and a man left to die in the snow. What he told them changed their path forever. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The ascent had begun in the pale light of dawn, when the horizon was little more than a bruised ribbon of gray and violet above the serrated edges of the peaks. The two climbers had left their camp long before the sun rose, their breath already turning to smoke in the thin, frozen air. They were no strangers to this world of stone and ice. Years of expeditions had carved into their bodies a kind of endurance that most men never knew. Still, the mountain was always a reminder of mortality, no matter how skilled the climber. Its ridges and crevasses, its hidden storms and unrelenting cold, were more ancient than ambition, and more powerful than the human spirit. Yet ambition was what drove them onward, step after step, against the biting wind that clawed at their faces and stiffened their fingers. One of them carried his drive like fire in his chest, dreaming of the summit as if it were the only place left in the world that mattered. The other moved with quieter determination, his mind focused not only on the goal, but also on the countless dangers that lurked along the route. Between them stretched a rope, a lifeline both literal and symbolic, binding their fates together in that vast, indifferent wilderness. They ascended steadily, their crampons biting into the crust of ice, their axes sinking into frozen walls. The valley behind them shrank to a shadow, and the sound of their world diminished until it was only the crunch of snow beneath boots and the whistle of wind through gullies. Time slowed in such places, or perhaps it accelerated so fast that hours bled together, impossible to measure. Their thoughts narrowed to rhythm, to breath, to survival. It was in this suspended state that the first signs of something wrong appeared. A flash of color against the endless white caught the eye of the more cautious climber. He halted, raised a gloved hand, and pointed. There, half buried beneath a drift of snow, lay a torn scrap of fabric that had once been part of a rucksack. The threads flapped limply in the wind, stained dark in patches that could only have been blood once. They approached slowly, kneeling in the snow, brushing away the frost with stiff fingers. The rucksack itself lay gutted, its contents strewn by wind or hand, impossible to tell. A tangle of rope, frozen solid, a dented cooking tin, and a water bottle split at the seam. These were not the deliberate signs of a camp packed away and abandoned with order. They were fragments of something sudden, something violent, or at least desperate. The men exchanged a glance but said nothing. Words in that silence seemed unwelcome, almost sacrilegious, as though the mountain itself were listening. A few meters farther on, half concealed by rock and snow, they found the remnants of a tent. The poles bent like broken bones, the nylon canopy shredded and half lifted by the wind, the guy lines torn away. One corner of the structure still clung stubbornly to the ice, fluttering like a wounded bird. The sight unsettled them both. Climbers did not leave tents in such condition unless forced to flee. Even storms, however brutal, left behind the skeleton of order. This was ruin, not simply ruin by weather, but by something else, and they felt the first stirrings of unease in their stomachs. As they climbed past this wreckage, the trail of disturbance continued. Footprints, old but not entirely erased, pressed into the snow. Some were deep and erratic, as if made by someone stumbling or dragged against his will. Others branched off, higher, leading toward the ridge. The wind had done its best to erase the story, but traces remained, and in those traces, the climbers read uncertainty. Again, they said nothing, for there was no comfort in speculation. The hours stretched, the light shifted from the pale blush of dawn to the hard brilliance of morning. Clouds gathered above the higher ridges, their bellies swollen with promise of storm. The climbers pressed forward, each weighed down not only by gear, but by the invisible presence of what they had found. And then, as the slope curved around a rocky outcrop, they saw it, a small tent, still standing, though barely. Its canvas sagged inward, the poles straining against the weight of snow, the fly sheet half torn and flapping like a sail. It looked as though a single strong gust might finish what time and neglect had already begun. The cautious climber raised a hand again, and together they approached. The snow around the tent was disturbed in irregular patterns, as though someone had crawled rather than walked. A faint trail of frozen drops, too dark against the whiteness to be mistaken, led from the doorway into the drift nearby. One of them knelt, peering into the half-collapsed entrance. At first he thought it empty. Then, with a sinking chill colder than the air itself, he saw the outline of a human body inside, curled tightly in a sleeping bag that had long since lost its warmth. The face that stared out was pale, lips cracked, eyes closed, but not lifeless. A faint wisp of breath clouded the air before vanishing. They scrambled to action, cutting away the flaps of ice that had frozen the zipper shut, crawling inside despite the cramped space. The man they found was in dire condition. His skin was mottled with frostbite, his fingers swollen and purple. His chest rose shallowly, each breath a ragged wheeze. The smell inside the tent was of damp fabric, sweat long turned sour, and the faint coppery tang of blood. They knew instantly that without intervention he would not last long. Carefully, they lifted him, their own bodies forming a shield against the wind, and began the work of coaxing life back into him with what little resources they carried. One of them lit a small stove just outside the tent, its flame hissing to life in the thin air. Snow melted into water, which they fed to the man in small sips against his cracked lips. They rubbed his hands and feet, trying to restore some circulation. His eyelids fluttered, and for the first time a flicker of awareness showed in his face. The sight of that fragile thread of life stirred something heavy in their chests. Pity. Yes, but also dread. Whoever he was, however he had come to be here, the mountain had not been his only enemy. That much was written in the ruined gear, in the scattered remains, in the look of someone abandoned to die. As they worked, the silence pressed closer, thicker. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. They could hear their own heartbeats, the rasp of the stranger's lungs, the distant groan of shifting ice high above the ridge. And in that silence, the two climbers felt the weight of a story larger than themselves, one that had begun before they arrived, and whose ending was far from clear. They had set out that morning with dreams of reaching the summit, of standing where few ever had, of planting their will on the indifferent crown of the mountain. Now, with a half-dead man in their care, and shadows gathering in the sky above, the summit seemed to recede into another world altogether. What lay ahead was no longer a contest between man and nature alone. Something else lurked higher on the slope, waiting, unseen but already shaping their path. The man in the sleeping bag stirred again, a faint sound rising from his throat. The climbers leaned closer, straining to catch it. His eyes opened a fraction, glazed and searching, and his lips moved without sound. They did not yet know what he would tell them, what truths or terrors waited above, but they knew that this discovery had changed everything. Their journey to the summit had already been rewritten. The mountain, vast and indifferent, had given them not triumph, not beauty, but a secret. And secrets in the high places were as dangerous as any avalanche. The stranger's lips moved soundlessly at first, his chest rising with shallow effort, and the two climbers leaned close, straining to catch even the faintest fragment of what he tried to say. The thin air carried little more than a whisper, broken, almost lost against the wind that rattled the tent fabric above their heads. They gave him another sip of water, carefully trickled against his cracked lips, and slowly the sound grew into words. They were not words of thanks, not the ramblings of someone simply grateful to be alive, but pieces of something darker, fragments of a tale that settled on them with the chill weight of dread. The man coughed, the effort racking his body, and then he began to speak with a voice that carried both desperation and fear. He told them how he had set out as part of a small group. They had planned the ascent with care, trained for months, dreamed of this very mountain as the pinnacle of their climbing lives. For the first days, everything went according to plan. The weather, though harsh, was manageable, and their spirits carried them higher step by step. But as they moved beyond the safer slopes, they encountered others on the mountain, men who at first appeared to be fellow climbers. Their clothing was the same, their gear indistinguishable from any other expedition. Only later did their true nature reveal itself. These were not men chasing the summit for glory or for personal triumph. They had come to the mountain for something else entirely. The wounded climber's voice broke into silences, his sentences halting, as if memory itself pained him. He described how the strangers demanded equipment under the pretense of helping lighten the load. At first, his team thought it was an act of camaraderie, a sharing of resources in an environment where cooperation meant survival. But the truth was harsher. They were thieves, opportunists, predators disguised as mountaineers. They did not climb for the summit, but for what others carried with them: food, fuel, oxygen. They lurked higher along the ridges, waiting for the exhausted, for the stragglers, for those most vulnerable. The man coughed again, his hand clutching weakly at his chest, as though to hold himself together. He said that when his group refused to surrender supplies, the strangers turned violent. Fists and boots in the snow, gear ripped from frozen hands, the merciless crack of ice axes used not for ascent, but for intimidation. He himself had been singled out when he lagged behind. His friends tried to intervene, but the strangers outnumbered them, stronger and more ruthless. In the chaos, he was struck hard, thrown from a ledge, his body rolling down the slope until the mountain caught him in its cruel embrace. When he regained his senses, broken and bleeding, he was alone. He never saw his companions again. The climbers listening felt the air grow heavier with every word. It was one thing to face storms, avalanches, and the thin line of survival drawn by the mountain itself. But to know that other men, fellow humans bound by the same fragile pursuit, could turn into hunters, preying on those who shared the same path, that knowledge was colder than the ice beneath their boots. The mountain, indifferent as it was, had never seemed so cruel as in that moment, when it was revealed as a stage for human malice. The stranger's tale continued, though his voice faltered often. He described the slow crawl to his ruined tent, the attempt to fashion shelter from what little remained. Days had blurred together in hunger and thirst. His wounds throbbed with each shallow breath, his ribs stabbing him when he tried to move. He had waited for help or for death, whichever would come first. But the snow gave him only silence, until finally the two climbers had arrived. He looked at them with hollow eyes, their own reflections flickering in the dim light of the stove outside, and whispered that there were more of them higher up. The men who had attacked him hadn't left the mountain. They were waiting. A silence followed that confession, more profound than any before. The two climbers exchanged glances, each one reading the same thought in the other's eyes. The summit, once a shining beacon in their minds, now loomed behind a veil of uncertainty. To go higher was not simply to risk frostbite, exhaustion, or weather. It was to risk encountering the very men the wounded climber described. predators in a place where trust had always been sacred, where to see another human face on the ice was to feel a kind of relief. Now that reassurance had been twisted into suspicion. The man slumped back, his strength spent after the telling, his chest rattled with each breath, his skin pale as the snow outside. He had given them his truth, or what seemed like truth, and now he looked at them with a silent plea they could not ignore. They fed him more water, a few morsels of food, and wrapped him tighter in his bag. He closed his eyes but did not sleep easily. His body trembled, as though the memory of violence still shook him. The climbers remained by his side as the day grew old. They felt the weight of choice pressing upon them. To abandon him was unthinkable, yet to stay meant their expedition would end there, swallowed by the mountain as surely as if they had fallen into a crevasse. And what of the men above? If the stranger spoke truth, then others were at risk, other climbers ascending in ignorance toward danger. The rope that bound the two climbers together now seemed to bind them also to a duty greater than their ambition. The wind howled louder outside the tent, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of storm. They knew time was not their ally. Supplies were finite, oxygen already thinning, weather always poised to turn deadly. Still they lingered, weighing options in silence. Neither spoke of the summit anymore, though the thought still burned in the heart of one of them. Instead, they thought of survival, of responsibility, of what it meant to find another human being so broken, yet so desperate to warn them. As night settled on the slope, darkness fell heavy, pierced only by the weak glow of their small stove and the occasional groan of ice shifting far above. The stranger dozed in restless fits, whispering words in half-dreams, fragments of terror and betrayal. The climbers listened, not to the sense of the words, but to the tone. A man broken not just by the mountain, but by men like him. Men who should have been his brothers on the rope, but instead became his executioners. The mountain outside slept in silence, but inside the tent, 3 souls shared its burden. 2 were uninjured, strong enough to choose their path. The third, clinging to life by a thread, had already shown them what the cost of choice could be. And as the long night pressed upon them, the 2 climbers understood that with the coming dawn, they would need to act. They would either retreat, carrying the wounded man towards safety, or ascend, risking everything to discover whether the horror he described still lurked in the heights above. Dawn in the mountains is never gentle. It came with knives of cold light, cutting through the fabric of the tent and driving them awake with its harshness. The air was brittle, so thin it seemed to resist their lungs. The stranger stirred weakly, opening his eyes to meet theirs. His lips parted, and though no sound came, they read the meaning in his gaze. Do not go up. They could see it there, written in the exhaustion of his body and the haunted emptiness of his stare. But choice was not so simple, not when ambition and fear and duty wove themselves into knots inside their minds. They rose, packed what they could, and prepared for the decision that would come with the climb. The stranger's story was not finished. It lived on in their thoughts, in the broken gear they had seen along the slope, in the heavy silence that hung over the mountain. When they stepped outside, the wind met them with icy teeth, the sky above already darkening with hints of storm. They looked upward, to where the ridge bent into clouds, and for the first time since the expedition began, they didn't see the summit. They saw only the shadow of danger waiting, and the knowledge that the stranger's tale had drawn them into a reality darker than the mountain itself. The morning after the stranger's confession began with silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the kind that presses against the skin, heavy and suffocating, carrying with it the weight of what must be decided. The two climbers emerged from the tent into a world stripped bare by cold. The sky above was pale, hard, and unyielding, a dome of thinning blue in which the promise of storm already lurked. Their breaths burst in white clouds, their bodies moving stiffly beneath the strain of exhaustion and the weight of choices left unresolved. Behind them, in the tattered tent, the wounded man lay curled in his bag, alive but fragile, his chest rising with shallow effort. He had given them his truth, whether born of memory or fever, and now it had become their burden. They set to work, moving in practiced silence. Food was rationed carefully. A few mouthfuls of dried meat and a small measure of melted snow passed to the stranger's lips. They tightened the cords of his bag, pulling the fabric close around his neck to trap what little heat remained. One of them lingered longer, adjusting the broken poles of the tent so that the wind might not strip it entirely away. The other busied himself by marking coordinates into their device, setting a point they could return to if they survived the climb. Neither admitted aloud what they knew, that leaving him behind, even for a few hours, might mean abandoning him to death. Yet the need to know if his story was true was stronger, at least for one of them, than the voice of mercy whispering to stay. They secured their own gear, checked ropes and harnesses, and when all was ready, they looked at one another across the snow. No words passed between them, but in the tilt of a head, in the grip of a glove, the agreement was made. They would ascend. Not for glory now, nor for the shimmering prize of the summit, but for truth, for certainty, for the knowledge of what lay ahead. With that silent covenant, they turned their backs on the fragile shelter and began the climb upward. The slope steepened quickly. Ice walls loomed above, ridges rose like the spines of some ancient beast, and every step became a negotiation with gravity. Their bodies strained against the thin air, lungs burning as though breathing fire. Muscles quivered with fatigue, but training and discipline carried them forward. The rope between them stretched and slackened, an umbilical cord binding them against the abyss. Beneath their boots, the mountain groaned with hidden shifts, sending faint tremors through the crust of snow and ice. The higher they climbed, the more the world below dissolved into mist and memory, until there was nothing but rock, wind, and the endless vertical of their ambition. The storm's first whispers began to show. Thin veils of snow danced through the air, carried by sudden gusts that nearly tore the axes from their hands. They pressed themselves against the ice, anchoring with screws and lines, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed upward. Hours passed in this rhythm, each moment measured not by time, but by the beat of their hearts, by the next handhold, the next foothold. It was during a pause on a narrow ledge that they found the first undeniable sign. Half buried in snow was a glove, its fabric torn and stiff with ice. The brand was known, common among climbers, but this glove bore marks that had nothing to do with weather. The leather of the palm was split as if ripped by force. A few meters away lay a rope, frayed and cut. One climber picked it up, ran it through his gloved fingers, and then tossed it aside, as though the touch itself was poison. Their eyes met, the truth already forming between them. They pressed on. Higher. Through a couloir that narrowed like the throat of a beast, they pulled themselves upward. There, clinging to the wall, they found another trace. A carabiner snapped clean in two, the metal edges rough, not from the stress of weight, but from deliberate tampering. The air thickened with dread, the silence of the mountain now seeming to pulse with the echo of human malice. As they climbed, the findings became more frequent. A torn scrap of jacket flapping in the wind, the faint imprint of boots pressed into the snow, not yet erased by weather. And then, rounding a shoulder of rock, they came upon a hollow carved by ice, where the truth could no longer be doubted. Hidden from plain sight, tucked away from the trail, was a cache. Piled haphazardly yet unmistakably, it contained what had once belonged to many. Oxygen cylinders stacked like trophies, packs of food, ropes, helmets, even personal belongings, a diary, a photograph, a watch. Each item was ordinary, but together they formed a grotesque collection. No climber abandoned such things willingly. They had been taken. The two men stood in the snow, gazing at the pile with hearts beating too loud in their chests. This was no accident, no misfortune. The stranger's story had been true. Somewhere above them, or perhaps hidden in the very shadows of the rocks around them, those who had gathered these spoils waited still. The climbers felt exposed, as if unseen eyes watched from the ridges, measuring them, weighing whether to let them pass or to strike. The more ambitious of the two clenched his fists, the summit still whispering its siren call. To turn back now meant surrender, meant retreat under the weight of another man's story. But the cautious one felt the mountain differently. He looked at the cache, at the stripped-down remnants of lives once tied to this place, and saw not a challenge to overcome, but a warning carved in ice. His thoughts turned to the wounded man they had left behind, to the fragile line of breath that tied him to life. If they delayed, if they pressed onward, they might never return to him. They argued without words as they stood there, their eyes locked, the storm beginning to close around them. Snow fell heavier, wind shrieked against the rock, and the cache before them seemed to fade in and out of sight. In the end, the mountain itself made the decision. A low rumble rolled across the heights, the groan of shifting ice, and a sheet of snow broke loose high above. It did not strike them, but it thundered down a gully with such force that the ground beneath their feet trembled. The message was clear. The summit, the climb, the glory. It all balanced on the edge of catastrophe. They turned away from the cache at last, their faces set with grim resolve. Their ascent had answered the question. The wounded man had spoken truth. There were predators in the high places, thieves who fed not on the mountain, but on those who sought to conquer it. The climbers descended slowly, carefully, their axes biting into ice, their boots pressing into snow with renewed caution. With each step downward, the weight of their discovery pressed heavier. Above them, shrouded in storm, the mountain kept its secrets, indifferent as ever. But they carried its truth inside them now, a truth darker than any cloud. When at last they saw the tattered tent once more, huddled against the slope, the relief was sharp enough to feel like pain. They stumbled toward it, their bodies aching, their lungs burning, their minds filled with the memory of that hidden cache. Inside, the wounded man still breathed, faint and fragile, his eyes flickering open as they entered. They knelt beside him, their hands moving quickly to provide water, warmth, comfort. His gaze searched theirs, questions unspoken but understood. They nodded, and in that gesture conveyed everything. He had not lied. He had not been mad. They had seen the proof with their own eyes. Night fell again on the mountain, the storm rising into a howl that rattled the tent and buried their tracks beneath fresh snow. The climbers sat in silence, their thoughts circling the same truth. The mountain would wait, its summit untouched by them, but the lives it demanded were not always taken by its hand alone. Sometimes men themselves were the avalanche. Sometimes the cruelest danger lay not in the ice, but in the hearts of those who climbed beside you. And with that knowledge pressing on them like the very weight of the mountain itself, they prepared for what must come next. The descent, the struggle to bring the wounded man down alive, and the burden of truth they would carry with them into the world below. The storm raged through the night, battering the fragile tent, until it seemed inevitable that the fabric would tear and collapse around them. The two climbers lay awake, their bodies pressed against the snow-packed floor, listening to the mountain's voice in the furious wind. Each gust felt like a hand shaking the canvas, demanding that they make their decision before it was too late. Their discovery of the hidden cache weighed on them heavily, turning every breath into a reminder of what they had seen, what they now carried in memory. They knew that their path was split in two, upward toward the summit, into danger, or downward toward the base, into survival. Neither choice came without loss, and as the hours stretched, the decision grew inside them like a stone in the chest. When dawn returned, it brought no gentleness. The wind lessened, but the air was sharp, biting with renewed cold. The snow outside had deepened, smoothing over the traces of their footprints, erasing all signs of their climb, as if the mountain itself wished to deny what they had found. They sat in silence, sharing a meal of crumbs and melted ice, their hands slow, their faces marked by exhaustion. The wounded man stirred beside them, his eyes opening weakly. He seemed diminished, as though the night had stolen another piece of his strength. His gaze, hollow yet steady, turned to them, and though no words passed his lips, they knew what he asked. Would they risk everything for a peak that offered nothing but emptiness? Or would they return him and his truth to the world below? The ambitious climber looked toward the ridge, still shrouded in cloud, and for a moment his breath caught at the thought of standing upon the summit. It was the dream that had brought him here, the fire that had burned in him for years. Yet in his heart, the vision was now blurred by the memory of oxygen tanks piled like stolen treasure, of ropes cut and jackets torn, of a truth too grim to deny. The cautious one watched his companion closely, reading the struggle within him. He too had once longed for the summit, but the mountain had shown them another side of itself, one where ambition met cruelty, and where reaching higher might only mean falling faster. At last, with a slow and heavy breath, the decision settled between them. They would turn back. The summit could wait, perhaps forever, but the fragile life they had found in the tent could not. Their dream of conquest would remain unfinished, but there was no shame in choosing life over death, no shame in carrying another soul down from the heights. They rose and set about their preparations, pulling ropes from packs, adjusting harnesses, and fashioning a crude stretcher from poles and webbing. The wounded man, too weak to walk, was lifted carefully, his face twisting with pain, his breaths shallow and strained. They wrapped him in every layer of spare fabric they possessed, securing him tightly so that the descent might not shake him into the abyss. The journey down began with difficulty. The snow was soft and deep, every step threatening to swallow their boots. They moved slowly, one guiding from above, the other controlling the weight of the stretcher as it slid on the slope. Their muscles ached with the strain, the rope biting into their shoulders, their lungs screaming in protest. The mountain fought them with every meter, demanding tribute for each step downward. Avalanches whispered from the ridges, the air cracked with sudden gusts, and more than once they nearly lost their balance, saved only by the taut rope and their refusal to let go. The hours dragged into a blur. The sun climbed and fell, hidden often by clouds, casting the world in a shifting palette of silver and gray. The wounded man moaned softly, his voice little more than a thread in the howl of the wind. They spoke no words, for speech wasted breath, and breath was already too scarce. They moved as though in a trance, their will narrowed to the single purpose of survival, each step downward, another rebellion against the mountain's will to hold them. As they descended lower, the terrain shifted from sheer ice to broken rock and snowfields. Their progress grew steadier, though no less dangerous. Once they slipped across a hidden crevasse, the stretcher tilting wildly, the man nearly thrown into the darkness below. Their hearts hammered as they fought to pull him back, every muscle screaming in agony. When at last he lay safe on the snow again, their faces were pale, their eyes hollow with the knowledge of how close they had come to failure. But still they pressed on, for turning back was no longer possible. Toward evening, when the storm at last broke apart and the sky revealed a stretch of pale light, they reached the lower slopes where others had begun to establish camps. The sight of tents dotting the white plain struck them with an almost unbearable wave of relief. Their shouts carried across the snow, and soon figures moved toward them, rescuers, climbers, men and women, whose faces reflected shock at the sight of the burden they bore. Hands reached out, ropes were seized, and the wounded man was taken from them with care. His body was lifted toward safety, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by those who knew how close to death he had come. The two climbers sank to the snow, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their faces gaunt with hunger and strain. Questions came, voices asking where they had found him, what had happened, what dangers still lay above. They answered slowly, telling of the ruined tent, the confession, the cache hidden in the ice. As their words spread, silence fell among those gathered, a silence born not of disbelief, but of horror. No one wanted to imagine that such darkness could exist on the mountain, that the pursuit of a summit could be overshadowed by the cruelty of man. Yet the evidence was undeniable, carried in their eyes, in their words, and in the battered body of the man they had brought down. The night that followed was quiet in the camp, though the mountain still roared in the distance. Around the small fires, climbers whispered to one another, their dreams of ascent tempered now by fear. The summit still waited above, unchanging, indifferent, but the path toward it had been stained by human hands. The two climbers lay in their tent, their bodies too heavy to move, their eyes staring into the dark. They knew their journey was over, their chance at glory sacrificed. Yet in their hearts there was no regret, only the lingering ache of truth. They had chosen life over ambition, chosen to carry another man instead of chasing their own triumph. In the days that followed, the wounded man began to recover under the care of medics. His strength was slow to return, but his voice grew clearer, his story firmer. He spoke of the men who haunted the heights, of how they took what was not theirs, of how they left others to die in the snow. His words traveled beyond the camp, down to the villages, and soon across the world. Whispers became stories, stories became warnings, and warnings became part of the lore of the mountain. The two climbers watched it unfold with weary eyes, knowing that though the mountain would remain indifferent, the world of men could no longer ignore what had been revealed. When at last they left the mountain behind, their steps heavy on the path downward, they felt as though a part of themselves had been left behind in the snow. Not the part that had dreamed of the summit, but the part that had learned the truth, that the mountain's greatest danger was not in its storms or its ice, but in the hearts of those who walked upon it. They carried that knowledge like a scar, invisible yet eternal, a reminder of what they had seen and chosen. The summit remained untouched by them, but they had gained something greater than glory, the certainty that life, even fragile and fleeting, is worth more than any peak. And so the mountain stood, vast and silent, its ridges cutting against the sky, its slopes gleaming with ice. It had not changed, would not change, for mountains are eternal in their indifference. But for those who had climbed it, who had faced not only its storms, but the cruelty of men, the memory would remain. The silence of the high places would forever carry with it the echo of choice, the shadow of hidden caches, and the fragile breath of a wounded man who lived because two climbers chose to descend instead of ascend. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself,